I burned the bread on my third morning as a wife. Not badly, just enough that the bottom crust had gone dark, just enough that any reasonable person would have simply cut it off and served it anyway. My mother-in-law did not say a word about it. She simply looked at it, looked at me, and quietly set a second loaf to rise before the first one had even finished cooling. I remember standing there in that unfamiliar kitchen, the smell of scorched crust still hanging in the air, my hands still dusted with flour, feeling smaller than I had felt in years. Nobody had raised their voice. Nobody had said a single unkind word. And yet I felt, in that silence, more corrected than I ever had by any direct scolding in my entire childhood. That silence taught me more in one morning than any conversation could have. And it was only the first of dozens of hard, unspoken rules I would learn in my first year as an Amish wife. Rules nobody writes down. Rules that arrive only through the particular sting of getting them wrong. My name is Elizabeth. I married at 20. And what I want to tell you tonight is not the story of my wedding day. It is the story of the weeks that came after it. The crash course nobody warns a new bride about. The rules you are simply expected to already understand the moment the ceremony ends. Let me start with the rule about mistakes. Before marriage, as a daughter still in my parents' house, mistakes were treated as part of learning. My mother corrected me gently, patiently, the way you correct a child who is still growing into her skills. The moment I became a wife, that patience seemed to evaporate overnight, not because anyone was cruel, but because an entirely different standard silently replaced the old one. A wife was not supposed to still be learning. A wife was supposed to already know. I discovered this rule through 100 small humiliations that first month. Bread that rose wrong, seams sewn crooked, a meal served 10 minutes later than the men expected to sit down. Each mistake was met not with correction, exactly, but with a particular quality of silence. A silence that told me, more clearly than any lecture could have, that I had failed at something I was supposed to have already mastered. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think this rule is harder than it sounds. Nobody tells a new bride, directly, that she is now expected to be complete. It arrives only through the absence of the patience she used to receive. You learn the rule by feeling its edges, over and over, until the shape of it becomes clear. The second hard rule was about my mother-in-law's kitchen. I moved into a household that was not fully my own, a common arrangement in our community, where a young couple often lived with or very near the husband's parents in the first years of marriage, learning the rhythms of independent household management gradually. What this meant, in practice, was that I was cooking in a kitchen that had belonged to another woman for 30 years, following systems and habits that were invisible to me and completely obvious to her. I remember reaching for a particular pot on my second week, a pot I had used at home for exactly this purpose my entire life, and being told, gently but firmly, that this pot was reserved for a different task entirely in this household. I remember rearranging the pantry shelves according to what seemed logical to me, only to find them silently rearranged back the following morning. Nothing was ever said directly, but the message arrived clearly every single time. This kitchen has rules, and they are not yours to set. It took me nearly a year to understand that I was not simply learning a new kitchen. I was learning an entire new authority structure, one where my mother-in-law's decades of accumulated household knowledge outranked my own instincts by default, regardless of whether her way or mine was actually better in any given moment. I think what made this rule so hard to name, even to myself, was that my mother-in-law was never once unkind about it. She never criticized me directly. She simply, quietly, continuously demonstrated the correct way of doing things over and over, until I absorbed the lesson through sheer repetition rather than through any single conversation. There was a kind of relentless gentleness to it that made it almost impossible to resent, even as I felt myself shrinking a little more each week into the shape of someone else's decades-old habits. The third hard rule, and this is the one that still surprises people most when I tell it, was about disagreement between women. I had assumed, naively, that once I was married, my closest ally in learning this new life would be my mother-in-law. Two women, after all, sharing a kitchen and a household. What I discovered instead was more complicated. There was an unspoken hierarchy among the women in a household that mirrored, in its own way, the hierarchy among the men. My opinion, as the newest and youngest wife, carried the least weight in nearly every domestic decision, even ones that directly concerned my own daily life. I remember wanting, in my first few months, to organize our canning schedule differently than it had always been done. A small thing, a matter of efficiency more than principle. I raised the idea carefully, the way I had learned to raise anything. It was met with polite acknowledgement, and then, quietly, completely ignored. The old schedule continued exactly as it always had. I understood, slowly, that suggestions from a new wife were heard, in a technical sense, and then filed away as something to be considered once she had earned enough years and enough trust to actually be listened to. I want to ask you something right now. Have you ever entered a new environment, a job, a family, a community, believing your ideas would be welcomed, only to discover an invisible hierarchy of trust that had to be earned slowly, year by year, before your voice actually carried weight? That is exactly the rule I learned that first year. Not cruelty, just a hierarchy so old and so assumed that nobody thought to explain it to me directly. The fourth rule was the hardest of all. It was about my own exhaustion. In that first year, learning an entirely new household, an entirely new set of relationships, an entirely new version of myself as a wife rather than a daughter, I was more tired than I had ever been in my life. And I learned through the same quiet mechanism as everything else, that this exhaustion was not something to be spoken about directly. Complaining about tiredness read, in our community, as a kind of weakness, a suggestion that I was not yet suited to the role I had taken on, so I learned to carry it silently, the way the women around me appeared to carry theirs. It was nearly 2 years before another young wife, married the same year as me, finally admitted to me privately how exhausted she had felt in her own first year. We were sitting together at a quilting gathering, half listening to the older women's conversation across the room, when she said it quietly, almost as a confession, that her first year had nearly broken her, that she had cried more nights than she ever told anyone, that she had assumed, the entire time, that she was simply not strong enough for the life she had chosen. I remember the relief of that conversation almost more than I remember any single event from those difficult early months. The simple discovery that I had not been alone in any of it, that every new wife around me had likely been carrying the exact same silent exhaustion, the exact same crash course of unspoken rules, without any of us ever admitting it to each other until years later. That is what I want to leave you with tonight. Not just the specific rules, the mistakes, the kitchen, the hierarchy, the exhaustion, but the deeper pattern underneath all of them. So much of what is hardest about becoming a new wife, in any community, in any culture, is not any single rule itself. It is the isolation of believing you are the only one struggling to learn rules nobody thought to explain. I want to ask you something before I go. If you are in the middle of learning some new role right now, a marriage, a job, a family you have just joined, is there a rule you have been quietly struggling with, believing you are the only one who has not yet figured it out? I promise you, almost certainly, you are not alone in it. Somebody else, somewhere close to you, is carrying the exact same silent exhaustion, waiting for someone to finally say it out loud first. I wish someone had told me that in my first year. I am telling you now.